The candles were burning too bright, and Alina Hartley could feel her own heartbeat pounding against her ribs as she stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, gripping her worn gloves so tightly that her knuckles had turned pale. She had no business being here. Everyone around her seemed to know it too. The whispers had already started before she had even taken off her cloak. Alina was 22 years old, and she had not eaten a proper meal in 3 days. She had given the last of her coins to the apothecary that morning, hoping the medicine would ease her mother's cough before nightfall. She had told herself she would find something to eat once she returned home. But home was miles away, and this ball, this glittering, impossible ball hosted by the Duke of Ashcombe, was not a place for a woman like her. She had received the invitation 5 days earlier, a thick cream envelope sealed with wax, delivered by a footman who did not even look at her twice. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Her family name, Hartley, had once meant something in this city, back when her father was alive and their estate was full of laughter and warm fires. But her father had died owing more money than anyone could imagine, and since then, the Hartley name had become something people said quietly, followed by a shake of the head. Still, she had gone, not because she believed she belonged there, but because for one night she wanted to remember what it felt like to be someone. She wanted to stand beneath the chandeliers and pretend, even for an hour, that her life had not fallen apart. The ballroom was filled with silk gowns in shades of rose and lavender, with diamonds catching the candlelight, with laughter that rose and fell like music. Alina wore her mother's old gown, carefully mended at the hem, the color faded from years of storage. She had spent the afternoon trying to make it look presentable, pressing the fabric with a heated iron, sewing tiny stitches where the seams had begun to fray. It was not enough. She knew it the moment she walked through the doors and felt the eyes of the room shift toward her, then quickly away, as though she were something embarrassing to look at for too long. A group of young women stood near the refreshment table, fans moving lazily in front of their faces. Alina recognized one of them, Charlotte Pemberton, whose family had once been close with the Hartleys, back when such things mattered. "Is that Alina Hartley?" one of the women whispered, not quietly enough. "I heard her father left nothing but debts," another replied. "I cannot imagine why she was invited." Alina kept her chin lifted and walked past them, though her chest felt tight with humiliation. She found a quiet corner near one of the tall windows and stood there, watching the dancers move across the polished floor. The music was beautiful, a slow waltz played by a small orchestra tucked into the far corner, and for a moment she allowed herself to simply listen, to let the sound wash over her and quiet the noise in her mind. She had not seen the Duke yet. She had heard of him, of course. Everyone had. Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ashcombe, was known throughout the city as a man who kept mostly to himself, who rarely attended the social gatherings expected of a man in his position, and who had inherited both his title and a considerable fortune after the sudden death of his older brother 2 years earlier. Some called him cold, others called him mysterious. Alina had never given him much thought at all, until tonight, when his name was the reason she stood in this room, dressed in a gown that no longer fit the life she used to live. The heat in the ballroom seemed to grow with each passing hour. Hundreds of candles burned along the walls, and the press of bodies, the layers of silk and wool, made the air feel thick and heavy. Alina had not realized how weak she had become until she felt the room begin to tilt slightly around her, the edges of her vision blurring like watercolor left out in the rain. She told herself it was nothing. She had felt lightheaded before, especially in recent weeks, when meals had become something she gave to her mother first and thought of for herself only if anything remained. She pressed her hand against the cool stone of the window frame and took a slow breath, trying to steady herself. Across the room, a man in a dark coat turned his head slightly, as though something had caught his attention. He did not move yet. He simply watched. Alina closed her eyes for a moment, willing the dizziness to pass. When she opened them again, the room seemed brighter than before, almost painfully so, and the sound of the orchestra had begun to blur into something distant and strange, like music heard from underwater. She took a single step away from the window, thinking that perhaps some fresh air would help, that if she could only reach one of the side doors leading to the garden, she would be able to breathe properly again. But her legs did not carry her the way she expected. The floor seemed to shift beneath her feet, tilting like the deck of a ship, and the brilliant lights of the chandeliers scattered into fractured points of gold. No one near her seemed to notice at first. The crowd was too absorbed in its own laughter, its own dancing, its own carefully constructed world where a woman quietly struggling to stay upright was simply invisible. Alina reached out for something to hold, anything, but her fingers found only air. Her knees buckled, and the last thing she registered clearly was the sensation of falling, the ballroom tilting sideways, the golden light swallowing everything into a soft, spinning darkness. And then, just before the floor could meet her, something stopped her fall. Strong arms, sudden and steady, caught her before she hit the ground. The last sound she heard, faint and far away, was a deep voice saying her name, though she could not understand how anyone in that crowded room could possibly have known it. The world went dark. Somewhere above her, though she could not yet hear it clearly, a man's voice was calling for a physician, sharp and urgent, cutting through the music and the laughter like a blade through silk. But Alina Hartley knew none of that. She only knew the darkness and the strange, unexpected feeling that, for the first time that night, she was no longer falling alone. The ballroom had gone quiet in a way that felt almost unnatural. The orchestra faltered, the bow of the lead violinist pausing mid-stroke as heads turned toward the corner where a young woman had just collapsed. Whispers spread through the crowd like ripples across still water, each person leaning toward another to ask what had happened, though none of them had actually moved to help. It was the Duke who reached her first. Alexander Blackwood had been standing near the far wall for most of the evening, engaged in polite but distant conversation with a group of gentlemen discussing matters of little interest to him. He attended these events because his position required it, not because he found any pleasure in them. He had grown skilled at appearing present while his mind wandered elsewhere, but tonight, something had drawn his attention across the room long before Alina fell. He had noticed her the moment she arrived, not because of her gown, which was clearly older and carefully mended, nor because of the whispers that followed her through the room, but because of the way she carried herself despite them. She held her shoulders straight. She did not shrink from the glances or the murmured comments. There was something quietly dignified in the way she stood alone near the window, watching the dancers with an expression that seemed both wistful and composed. He had continued to watch her throughout the evening, more than he would have admitted to anyone. So when he saw her sway, when he saw the sudden paleness spread across her face, and her hand reach for support that was not there, he moved before he had even fully decided to. He crossed the ballroom quickly, his long strides cutting through startled guests who parted instinctively at his approach. He reached her just as her knees gave way, catching her before she could fall to the hard floor. Her weight settled against him, light and fragile, and he felt a sharp concern rise in his chest at how little substance there seemed to be beneath the fabric of her gown. "Fetch the physician," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned silence of the room. "Now." A servant scrambled to obey, disappearing through the crowd. Alexander lifted Alina carefully into his arms, ignoring the murmurs that rippled around him, the scandalized whispers of guests who had never seen the reserved Duke touch anyone so openly, let alone carry an unconscious woman through the middle of a ball. He did not care what they thought. He carried her through a side door, away from the crowded ballroom, into a quiet sitting room where the air was cooler, and the noise of the party faded into a distant hum. He laid her gently on a chaise near the window, his hand instinctively checking the pulse at her wrist, relief washing over him faintly when he felt it beating steady beneath his fingers, even if weaker than he would have liked. Her face was pale, her lips slightly parted, dark lashes resting against her cheeks. Even in this state, there was something striking about her, something that made him unwilling to look away. "Your Grace," came a voice from the doorway. He turned to find his housekeeper, Mrs. Whitmore, standing there with a look of concern etched into her features. "The physician has been sent for," she said. "Shall I bring water and a cool cloth?" "Yes, quickly, please." Mrs. Whitmore nodded and disappeared, leaving Alexander alone with the stranger who had, for reasons he could not yet explain, captured his full attention the moment she had walked through his doors. He knelt beside the chaise, studying her more closely now that they were away from the prying eyes of the ballroom. Her gown, though clearly old, had been cared for with obvious effort. Her gloves were worn thin at the fingertips. There was a thinness to her frame that spoke of hardship rather than fashion, and he felt a quiet anger stir within him, not at her, but at the world that had allowed a woman to reach such a state while surrounded by so much excess and indifference. When Mrs. Whitmore returned with a basin of water and a soft cloth, Alexander dipped the fabric gently and pressed it to Alina's forehead, watching her expression for any sign of stirring. It was several long minutes before her eyes finally fluttered open, unfocused at first, then slowly sharpening with confusion. "Where," she began, her voice faint and dry, "where am I?" "You are safe," Alexander said, his voice low and steady, meant to reassure rather than alarm. "You fainted at the ball. I brought you somewhere quieter." Alina's eyes widened as memory returned in fragments, the heat of the room, the dizziness, the sensation of falling. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment as she attempted to sit up too quickly, only for a wave of lightheadedness to force her back down. "Please," Alexander said gently, placing a steadying hand near her shoulder without quite touching her. "Rest a moment. The physician will arrive shortly." "I am so sorry," Alina whispered, mortification clear in her voice. "I did not mean to cause such a disturbance. I am certain everyone is speaking of it already." "Let them speak," Alexander replied simply. "It matters little to me what is said in that room." She looked at him then, truly looked at him for the first time, taking in the sharp lines of his face, the dark hair slightly disheveled from his hurried movement across the ballroom, and the steady, unreadable expression in his eyes. She had heard he was reserved, even cold, but the man kneeling beside her now seemed nothing of the sort. "You are the Duke," she said softly, more statement than question. "I am," he confirmed. "Alexander Blackwood, and you are Miss Hartley unless I am mistaken." "You know my name." "I made it my business to learn it earlier this evening," he admitted, and something in his tone made her cheeks warm again, though this time not entirely from embarrassment. Before she could respond, the physician arrived, a stout older man with kind eyes and quick, practiced hands. He examined Alina briefly, checking her pulse, the color of her skin, the dryness of her lips, before turning to address the Duke directly. "She is exhausted, Your Grace, and quite underfed if I am not mistaken. Nothing life-threatening, but she requires rest and proper nourishment without delay." Alina felt a fresh wave of shame wash over her at hearing her private struggles spoken aloud so plainly, but Alexander's expression did not shift into judgment. If anything, his jaw tightened, as though the news troubled him more than he cared to show. "She will have both," Alexander said firmly. "Thank you, doctor." Once the physician had gathered his things and departed, an uneasy quiet settled over the room. Alina pushed herself up slowly, this time managing to sit without the world tilting beneath her, though she kept one hand pressed against the arm of the chaise for support. "I should return home," she said, though the words came out weaker than she intended. "My mother will be worried." "Your mother," Alexander repeated carefully, "is she unwell?" Alina hesitated, unsure how much to reveal to a man she had only just met, a man whose position placed him so far above her own diminished circumstances that speaking honestly felt like exposing a wound in front of a stranger. But something in his eyes, patient, and without pity, made her feel that perhaps honesty would not be met with scorn here. "She has been ill for some time," Alina admitted quietly. "The physicians we can afford have done what little they can." Alexander said nothing for a long moment, simply watching her with an expression she could not quite read. Then he rose from where he had been kneeling and moved toward the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out into the darkened garden beyond. "You fainted tonight," he said slowly. "Not from nerves and not from the heat alone, though I imagine both played their part. You fainted because you have not been eating properly, because you have been giving what little you have to your mother's care, and because you came to this ball tonight despite knowing full well that the people inside it would treat you unkindly." Alina's breath caught in her throat. She had not told him any of that directly, yet somehow he had understood it all, pieced together from fragments she had let slip without realizing. "You did not have to help me," she said quietly. "Many others saw me fall, none of them moved." Alexander turned back to face her, his expression unreadable, though something in his eyes had softened considerably since the moment he had lifted her from the ballroom floor. "Then they were fools," he said simply. "I do not require an explanation for why I chose to act, Miss Hartley. I only wish I had reached you sooner." The words settled over her like something warm and unfamiliar, a kindness she had not expected to find in a room full of strangers, and certainly not from a man whose reputation had painted him as distant and unreachable. She did not know, in that moment, that this single night would change the entire course of her life, nor did she yet understand how deeply the Duke's quiet resolve to help her would come to matter in the days that followed. But as she sat there in the soft candlelight of his private sitting room, feeling steadier with each passing minute, Alina Hartley allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to believe that perhaps she was not as alone as she had always assumed. Outside the door, the ball continued, the music resuming its rhythm, the guests slowly returning to their dancing and their gossip. But inside that quiet room, something far more important had already begun, something neither Alina nor Alexander fully understood yet, though both could feel its presence settling quietly between them, patient and unhurried, waiting for the moment it would be ready to reveal itself. Alexander insisted that Alina remain in the townhouse until she had regained enough strength to travel safely, and though she protested weakly, her body betrayed her resolve almost immediately. The moment she attempted to stand fully, the room tilted again, gentler this time, but enough to convince her that arguing further would be foolish. Mrs. Whitmore arranged a small guest room near the eastern wing of the house, warm and quiet, far removed from the noise of the ballroom that still echoed faintly through the corridors below. A tray of simple food was brought to her, warm broth and soft bread, nothing elaborate, but Alina found herself overwhelmed by the sight of it in a way she had not expected. She had grown so used to counting every bite, to dividing what little existed between herself and her mother, that the sight of a meal meant entirely for her alone brought an unexpected sting of tears to her eyes. She ate slowly, mindful of the physician's warning not to overwhelm her stomach after so many days of insufficient meals, and by the time she finished, a heavy exhaustion settled over her, the kind that came not from illness but from relief, from the release of tension she had carried for so long that she had almost forgotten what its absence felt like. She slept deeply that night, without the familiar worry that usually kept her mind restless, without the quiet fear of what tomorrow might bring. When she woke the following morning, sunlight spilled gently through the curtains, and for a brief, disoriented moment, she forgot entirely where she was. Memory returned quickly, however, and with it, a fresh wave of embarrassment at the thought of the previous night's events. She had collapsed in front of half the city's most influential families. She had been carried from the ballroom by the Duke of Ashcombe himself. By now, she was certain, the story would have spread through every drawing room in the district. She dressed quickly, grateful to find her own gown cleaned and pressed, left neatly folded on a nearby chair. When she made her way downstairs, uncertain of where exactly she was meant to go, she found Alexander already awake, seated in a small study with papers spread across his desk, though his attention seemed far from the documents in front of him. He rose the moment he saw her, his expression shifting into something gentler than the composed formality she had expected. "Miss Hartley," he said, "you look considerably improved." "Thanks to your kindness, Your Grace," she replied, offering a small, grateful smile. "I cannot begin to express how much I appreciate everything you have done." "You need not thank me," he said simply. "Please sit. I imagine you are eager to return home, but I would ask that you allow my carriage to take you, rather than attempting the journey on foot." Alina hesitated only briefly before accepting, too aware of her own fragile state to protest something so sensible. As they sat together for a few final moments, Alexander studied her carefully, as though weighing something in his mind before finally speaking again. "Miss Hartley," he said, "I would like to help your family further if you will allow it." Alina's spine straightened instinctively, pride flaring despite everything. "Your Grace, I could not possibly accept charity." "It is not charity," he said calmly. "Consider it an investment in decency, if that makes the notion easier to accept. Your mother requires proper medical care. You require proper meals. These are not extravagances, Miss Hartley. They are necessities that no one in this city should be denied, least of all a family that once held its own place of respect." Alina felt her throat tighten, torn between the instinct to refuse and the painful awareness that refusing might cost her mother more than her pride could afford to lose. "I do not wish to be a burden," she whispered. "You are not," Alexander said firmly, "and I do not offer this lightly, nor do I offer it for the sake of appearances. I offer it because it is right, and because I find myself unwilling to simply forget what I witnessed last night." There was something in his voice, steady and sincere, that made it difficult for Alina to continue arguing. She had spent so long fighting battles alone, carrying the weight of her family's decline without complaint, that the presence of someone willing to share that burden, even slightly, felt almost overwhelming. "I will consider it," she said finally, though both of them understood the words for what they truly were, quiet acceptance disguised as hesitation. The carriage ride home was quiet, though not uncomfortable. Alina watched the city pass by through the window, the familiar streets growing narrower and less polished the closer they came to her family's modest home. When the carriage finally stopped outside the small townhouse where she and her mother had lived since her father's death, she turned to find Alexander watching her with an expression she could not quite name. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." "It was my honor, Miss Hartley," he replied. "I hope we may speak again soon." She stepped down from the carriage, and though she walked toward her front door with steady steps, her mind remained fixed on the strange, unexpected kindness of the man she had left behind, a man whose reputation had promised coldness but whose actions had revealed something entirely different. In the days that followed, that promise proved true in ways Alina could not have anticipated. A physician arrived at her mother's bedside within 2 days, sent quietly and without any note attached, though Alina understood immediately who was responsible. Fresh medicine appeared, along with warm meals delivered discreetly to their door each evening, enough for both her mother and herself, enough to finally silence the constant gnawing hunger that had shadowed her for so long. Her mother, Catherine Hartley, noticed the sudden change almost immediately, though it took several days before Alina found the courage to explain its source. "The Duke of Ashcombe," her mother repeated slowly, studying her daughter's face with the sharp intuition only a mother possessed. "And he has done all this without asking anything in return." "Nothing," Alina confirmed. "He insists it is simply the right thing to do." Her mother's expression softened into something thoughtful, almost knowing. "Be careful, my dear. Kindness such as this is rare, and rare things are often misunderstood." Alina did not fully understand her mother's warning at the time, though she would come to recognize its meaning far more clearly in the weeks ahead, when whispers began circulating through the city about the Duke's sudden, unexplained interest in a woman whose family had fallen so far from grace. It was nearly 2 weeks later when Alexander appeared at their door personally for the first time, dressed simply, without the formal trappings of his title, carrying himself with none of the distant reserve Alina had witnessed at the ball. Catherine, though weakened, insisted on receiving him in the small parlor, propped carefully against a cushion near the window. "Your Grace," she said warmly, "I owe you a debt I fear I cannot repay." "You owe me nothing, Mrs. Hartley," Alexander replied gently. "I only hope to see you continue improving." Catherine studied him carefully, the same sharp gaze she had turned on her daughter days earlier, now settling fully on the Duke himself. "My daughter tells me you have shown her remarkable kindness." "She deserves nothing less," Alexander said simply, and something in the quiet certainty of his voice made Catherine's expression shift into something close to understanding. As the weeks continued, Alexander's visits became more frequent, though always proper, always respectful of the boundaries expected between a man of his position and a woman of Alina's diminished circumstances. They walked together in the small garden behind the Hartley home. They spoke of books, of music, of the quiet dreams Alina had long since buried beneath the weight of her family's struggles. Slowly, carefully, something unspoken began to grow between them, delicate as new growth after a long, harsh winter. But not everyone watched this growing connection with kindness. Lord Charles Pemberton, a wealthy and ambitious nobleman who had long hoped to secure the Duke's favor through his own sister Charlotte, watched Alexander's increasing attention toward Alina with barely concealed resentment. He had spent months orchestrating opportunities for Charlotte to catch the Duke's eye, and the sudden appearance of a penniless woman disrupting those careful plans was not something he intended to accept quietly. It began with small comments dropped carefully into conversation at social gatherings, subtle enough to avoid direct accusation, yet sharp enough to plant seeds of doubt. Whispers began to circulate, questioning Alina's intentions, suggesting that her collapse at the ball had been calculated rather than genuine, a clever performance designed to capture the attention of a wealthy, unmarried Duke. Alina remained largely unaware of these rumors at first, too consumed with her mother's slow recovery and the quiet, unfamiliar happiness blooming within her own heart to notice the storm gathering just beyond her sight. But storms, once set into motion, rarely remain unnoticed for long, and it would not be many more weeks before Alina found herself forced to confront not only the whispers of a jealous society, but the deeper question of whether the growing bond between herself and the Duke could survive the weight of everything determined to tear it apart. The first sign that something had shifted came in the form of a letter, delivered without a name attached, slipped beneath the front door of the Hartley home late one evening. Alina found it the following morning, tucked half-hidden beneath the entryway rug, and something about its plain, unmarked envelope made her hesitate before opening it. The message inside was brief, cruel in its simplicity. It suggested, in carefully chosen words, that her collapse at the ball had been nothing more than a calculated act, designed to draw the attention of a wealthy, unmarried Duke desperate for an heir. It suggested that a woman with nothing left to lose might resort to any means necessary to secure her family's survival, even manipulating a man's sympathy through carefully staged weakness. Alina's hands trembled as she read the words a second time, her stomach twisting with a nauseating mixture of anger and humiliation. She had never once thought of her collapse as anything other than what it truly was, exhaustion born from hunger and grief, yet seeing it described so coldly, so deliberately twisted into something calculating, made her feel suddenly exposed, as though every private struggle she had endured had been turned into a weapon against her. She said nothing to her mother about the letter, unwilling to burden Catherine's fragile recovery with further worry. Instead, she folded the paper carefully and tucked it away, telling herself it meant nothing, that it was simply the bitter words of someone envious of a kindness they did not understand. But the letter, she soon discovered, was only the beginning. Within days, the whispers Alexander had dismissed so easily on the night of the ball began to grow louder, spreading through drawing rooms and dinner parties with the particular cruelty that only idle, comfortable society could produce. Alina began to notice the shift whenever she accompanied her mother to church, whenever she walked through the market square to purchase what small necessities they could now afford. Conversations paused as she passed. Eyes lingered a moment too long before sliding away. Smiles, when offered at all, felt brittle and insincere. It was Charlotte Pemberton who finally confronted her directly, cornering Alina outside a small dress shop on a quiet afternoon, her expression carrying none of the warmth Alina remembered from years earlier, when their families had still moved comfortably within the same circles. "You should be careful, Alina," Charlotte said, her voice sweet in tone but sharp in meaning. "People are beginning to talk. They say you fainted quite deliberately, knowing the Duke would be watching." "That is not true," Alina replied, striving to keep her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. "I fainted because I had not eaten properly in days, Charlotte. You know my family's circumstances as well as anyone." "Perhaps," Charlotte said, though her tone made clear she did not believe it. "But circumstances alone do not explain why the Duke has suddenly become so devoted to your welfare. Men of his position do not simply fall into infatuation with women who have nothing to offer them, unless, of course, they are cleverly encouraged to believe otherwise." Alina's jaw tightened, humiliation and fury warring within her chest. "I have never once encouraged his grace toward anything beyond simple kindness." Charlotte's smile turned thin. "Then I hope, for your sake, that everyone else comes to believe that as easily as you claim to." She walked away without another word, leaving Alina standing alone on the busy street, her hands clenched tightly at her sides, the familiar sting of shame threatening to overwhelm the fragile confidence she had only recently begun to rebuild. That evening, when Alexander arrived for his usual visit, Alina found herself unusually quiet, her responses shorter than usual, her gaze often drifting toward the window rather than meeting his. Alexander noticed immediately, his sharp perception cutting through her attempts to mask her distress. "Something troubles you," he said gently, once they had settled into the small garden behind her home, the evening air cool and fragrant with the scent of late-blooming roses. "You have barely spoken since I arrived." Alina hesitated, torn between her instinct to protect him from the ugliness circulating through the city and her growing awareness that hiding the truth would solve nothing. "There are rumors," she admitted finally, her voice quiet. "People believe I orchestrated my collapse at the ball, that I did so deliberately to secure your attention." Alexander's expression darkened, though his anger, she quickly realized, was not directed at her. "That is absurd." "Is it?" Alina asked, her voice tightening with frustration. "You are a duke, Alexander. I am a woman whose family has fallen into disgrace. Of course people would assume the worst. Why would they not?" "Because it is not the truth," Alexander said firmly, reaching for her hand before catching himself, his fingers hovering just short of touching hers, mindful of propriety even in his frustration. "Alina, I have known you these past weeks well enough to understand your character. You did not calculate that night. You simply survived it, as you have survived everything else thrown against you." Alina felt tears sting her eyes, though she blinked them back quickly, unwilling to appear weak even here, even in front of the one person who had shown her nothing but kindness since the night everything had changed. "I do not wish to bring further scandal upon your name," she whispered. "You have already given my family so much. I could not bear the thought of becoming a source of shame for you as well." "You could never be a source of shame," Alexander said, his voice low and certain. "If anything, Alina, you have reminded me of things I had long forgotten, kindness that expects nothing in return, strength that does not announce itself loudly but simply endures. Let them talk. Their opinions mean nothing to me. Despite his reassurance, the rumors continued to spread, growing more elaborate with each retelling, until eventually they reached the ears of individuals whose opinions carried far greater consequence than idle gossip among fashionable young women. It was nearly 3 weeks after the ball when Alexander received a summons from his aunt, Lady Beatrice Ashcombe, a formidable woman who had served as guardian of the family's reputation since the death of Alexander's parents years earlier. She arrived at his townhouse unannounced, her expression sharp with disapproval as she settled into his study without waiting for invitation. "I have heard troubling things, Alexander," she began without preamble. "Talk of a penniless woman collapsing conveniently into your arms, followed by weeks of your very public attention toward her family. Do you understand what such behavior suggests to society?" "I understand precisely what it suggests," Alexander replied evenly. "It suggests that idle minds with nothing better to occupy them enjoy inventing scandal where none exists." "Do not be naive," Lady Beatrice snapped. "You are the Duke of Ashcombe. Your choices carry weight far beyond your own personal feelings. If you continue this involvement with Miss Hartley, you risk not only your reputation but the standing of this entire family." Alexander's jaw tightened, though he kept his voice carefully controlled. "And what would you have me do, Aunt? Abandon a woman whose only crime was collapsing from hunger while surrounded by people too comfortable to notice her suffering?" "I would have you exercise caution," Lady Beatrice said, her tone softening slightly, though not by much. "There are far more suitable matches available to you, Alexander, women of proper standing, proper connections. Miss Hartley, however sympathetic her circumstances, is simply not among them." Alexander said nothing further, though the conversation lingered heavily in his mind long after his aunt departed. He had known, of course, that his growing attachment to Alina would eventually invite scrutiny. He had simply hoped it would take longer than a few short weeks for that scrutiny to arrive with such force. Meanwhile, Alina's own struggles deepened as the rumors continued to spread unchecked. Merchants who had once greeted her politely now regarded her with thinly veiled suspicion. Invitations that had begun trickling in following her association with the Duke suddenly stopped altogether, replaced instead by cold silence and averted eyes. The final blow came nearly a month after the ball, when Lord Pemberton himself arrived at the Hartley home, his expression carrying false sympathy that did little to mask the satisfaction lurking beneath. "Miss Hartley," he said, once Alina had reluctantly agreed to receive him, "I feel it only right to inform you of certain conversations occurring within society regarding your relationship with the Duke." "I am aware of the rumors, Lord Pemberton," Alina replied stiffly. "I fail to see why you have come to discuss them further." "Because I believe you should understand their consequences fully," he said. "The Duke's family is beginning to pressure him toward a more suitable match. Continued association with you, Miss Hartley, risks damaging not only his reputation, but any hope your own family might have of rebuilding what little respectability remains." Alina's chest tightened painfully, though she refused to let her expression betray the fear building within her. "And why, precisely, does this concern you so deeply?" "Because I have watched my sister's hopes for a respectable match slowly diminish, while the Duke's attention remains fixed elsewhere," Pemberton admitted, his mask slipping slightly. "I would simply ask you to consider, Miss Hartley, whether your presence in his life brings him more harm than good." He left shortly after, but his words lingered long into the evening, settling deep within Alina's already fragile confidence. She thought of Alexander's reputation, of the family legacy he carried, of the quiet strength he had shown her when no one else had bothered to notice her at all. She thought, too, of her mother, still recovering, still fragile, and of the very real possibility that continuing this connection might cost them everything Alexander had already so generously given. That night, long after her mother had fallen asleep, Alina sat alone by the window, staring out into the darkened street, wrestling with a decision she never imagined she would be forced to make. Perhaps, she thought reluctantly, the kindest thing she could do, both for herself and for the man who had shown her more compassion than anyone else in her life, was to step away before the damage became irreversible. She did not yet know that Alexander, in his own quiet study across the city, was wrestling with the very same fear, though his conclusion, when it finally came, would prove far different from her own. Alina decided, after a long and sleepless night, that she would end things before they went any further. She told herself it was an act of protection, both for Alexander's reputation and for her family's fragile stability, though the ache settling deep in her chest told a different story entirely. When Alexander arrived the following afternoon for his usual visit, Alina met him in the small garden with a composed, careful expression, one she had practiced in front of her mirror that morning until it no longer trembled. "Alexander," she began, before he could even settle into the seat across from her, "I believe it would be best if we did not continue seeing one another." His expression shifted immediately, confusion giving way to something sharper, more alert. "Why would you say such a thing?" "Because it is the truth," Alina said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "Your family disapproves. Society speaks of nothing else. I will not be the reason your name becomes tangled in scandal, nor will I allow my presence to cost you the respect you have worked to maintain." "Alina," Alexander said, his voice low but firm, "do you honestly believe I care so deeply for the opinions of people who have never once shown you a moment's true kindness?" "It is not only about their opinions," she replied, her composure beginning to waver despite her best efforts. "It is about what is practical, what is sensible. I have nothing to offer you, Alexander. No fortune, no standing, nothing but debt and gossip trailing behind my family's name." "You believe that is what I want from you?" Alexander asked, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that made her breath catch. "Fortune, standing. Alina, I have spent my entire life surrounded by both, and I have never once felt as understood, as genuinely seen, as I have during these past weeks with you." Alina's eyes filled with tears she could no longer hold back. "Then, why does it feel as though everyone is determined to tear this apart before it has even had the chance to grow?" "Because kindness threatens people who have built their entire lives around cruelty disguised as elegance," Alexander said gently, moving closer, though still respectful of the careful distance between them. "Alina, I will not pretend the road ahead will be easy. My aunt disapproves. Society will continue to whisper. But I refuse to walk away from something real simply because it frightens people comfortable with pretending." "Your aunt believes I am unsuitable," Alina whispered. "My aunt believes many things," Alexander replied. "She also once believed my brother incapable of leading this family, and yet he proved her wrong for years before his death. I have learned, Alina, that the opinions of those who fear change rarely reflect the truth of what genuinely matters." Alina studied him carefully, searching his expression for any sign of doubt, any flicker of hesitation that might confirm her fears. She found none. Only steady, quiet certainty, the same certainty that had carried her from the ballroom floor into his arms weeks earlier. "I am frightened," she admitted softly. "Not of losing you, though that frightens me as well. I am frightened of becoming a burden, of watching everything you have worked to build crumble because of your association with me." "You are not a burden, Alina," Alexander said firmly. "You are the first person in longer than I care to admit who has made me feel as though my title matters less than my character. I do not intend to lose that simply because a handful of bitter people cannot understand kindness without suspecting motive behind it." Alina allowed herself, finally, to believe him, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly as his words settled over her like warmth after a long, bitter cold. Yet even as hope began to rebuild within her, she remained painfully aware that words alone would not be enough to silence the growing storm surrounding them. That storm reached its peak barely a week later, when Lady Beatrice, having grown increasingly frustrated with her nephew's continued devotion, arranged a formal dinner intended to introduce Alexander to a woman she considered far more appropriate, a young noblewoman named Isabel Grantham, whose family carried both wealth and impeccable social standing. Alexander attended out of respect for his aunt, though his mind remained fixed entirely on Alina throughout the evening. Isabel, though pleasant enough, held little of the quiet depth he had come to treasure in Alina's company, and by the meal's end, Alexander found himself more determined than ever to make his intentions publicly known, regardless of the consequences. He arrived at the Hartley home the following morning, dressed formally, his expression carrying a seriousness Alina had not seen before. Catherine, sensing the importance of the moment, excused herself quietly to another room, leaving the two of them alone in the small parlor. "Alina," Alexander said, taking a slow breath before continuing, "I have spent these past weeks trying to determine the right course of action, weighing duty against desire, tradition against truth. I find myself, finally, unwilling to continue pretending that my feelings for you are anything less than what they truly are." Alina's heart pounded as she watched him kneel slowly before her, producing a small velvet box from within his coat. "I am aware," he continued, "that society will speak of this decision for months, perhaps years. I'm aware that my aunt will require considerable time before she comes to accept it fully. But I have learned, through knowing you, that true worth has nothing to do with fortune or standing, and everything to do with strength, kindness, and quiet resilience. Alina Hartley, I would be honored if you would allow me to spend the rest of my life proving that to you, and to everyone who ever doubted your worth." Tears streamed freely down Alina's face as she nodded, unable to form words fast enough to match the overwhelming emotion rising within her chest. "Yes," she finally whispered. "Yes, Alexander." News of their engagement spread through the city rapidly, and though whispers of scandal did not disappear entirely, they began to shift gradually into something closer to reluctant admiration, particularly once Lady Beatrice, after a private conversation with Alina herself, found her own resistance softening in the face of the young woman's evident sincerity and quiet strength. Lord Pemberton's schemes, once so carefully constructed, crumbled entirely beneath the weight of Alexander's public devotion, his sister Charlotte's disappointment quickly overshadowed by the undeniable truth of the couple's growing happiness. Alina's mother, Catherine, recovered steadily in the months that followed, her health restored fully under the continued care Alexander ensured without hesitation. The small townhouse that had once echoed with worry and quiet desperation slowly filled instead with laughter, with warmth, with the comfortable ease of a family finally free from the shadow of poverty and shame. On the day of their wedding, held not in the grand cathedral favored by high society, but in the quiet, sunlit garden behind Alexander's townhouse, Alina stood beneath an archway of white roses, dressed not in borrowed finery, but in a gown chosen entirely for herself, simple and elegant, reflecting the woman she had become rather than the desperation she had once worn like armor. As she walked toward Alexander, surrounded by the quiet support of those who had come to genuinely care for her, Charlotte among them, her earlier cruelty long since replaced by sincere friendship forged through Alina's unwavering grace, Alina felt none of the fear that had once defined her existence. She thought back briefly to that night at the ball, to the humiliation of collapsing before a crowd too indifferent to help her, to the strange, unexpected comfort of strong arms catching her before she could fall entirely. She realized, standing now beside the man who had reached for her when no one else had bothered to notice her struggle, that sometimes the darkest moments carried within them the quiet beginning of something extraordinary. Alexander took her hands in his his eyes carrying the same steady warmth she had first glimpsed in that quiet sitting room weeks after her collapse. And as they exchanged their vows beneath the soft afternoon light, Alina understood, with complete certainty, that she had not simply been rescued that night at the ball. She had been seen, truly seen, for the first time in longer than she could remember, by someone willing to look past the whispers, past the judgment, past everything society insisted mattered most, to find instead the quiet strength and resilience that had carried her through every hardship life had placed before her. And as the small gathering of guests applauded softly around them, as the late afternoon sun cast golden light across the garden where their story had truly begun, Alina Hartley, now Duchess of Ashcombe, allowed herself, finally, completely, to believe that she belonged exactly where she stood, no longer the woman who had collapsed alone at the ball, but the woman the Duke had chosen to stand beside, in full view of everyone who had once looked away.